And by that point, the Israeli was working for him. So you see, using an American Jew like as a Trojan horse, the Israelis still got into the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they controlled the World Trade Center all the way through 2001. In fact, the first plane went into their secure computer room, the North Tower. It went into Marsh McLennan, their company, and it went right into their computer room. The head of the Kroll Associates at the time was this man. His name is Michael Cherkasky. What's interesting to know about Michael Cherkasky is not only is he a big dedicated Zionist, but he was the person who led the New York investigation of the first bombing in 1993. He was in charge of investigation for the DA Robert Morgenthau. Robert Morgenthau is, of course, the son of Henry Morgenthau, who wrote basically the protocol that Germany must perish in World War II, that Germany has to be obliterated. This is how strict these Zionists are in their thinking. This man was in charge of the World Trade Center security. He joined Kroll. First he investigated in 1993 for Morgenthau. Then the next year he joined Kroll when they got the security contract. Then he became head of the company. And of course, in September 2001, security in the World Trade Center was seriously compromised because there were a bunch of Israelis in there putting bombs and det cord and thermite and nanothermite. So somebody, whoever's in charge of security, is part of the problem. Here's another Kroll associate here, Jerome Hauer. He was formerly with Kroll Associates, and he's the person who had the Office of Emergency Management. He was head of OEM for Giuliani. He's the person who made sure that the hardened bunker was put on the 23rd floor of Building 7. Building 7 is the building that fell down. Now, this is important to understand because that hardened bunker was most likely the place where the detonation team or the demolition team worked on 9/11. They were like right within eyesight of the Twin Towers, and they could manipulate all of those buttons and cords and things that had to be done at precise timing to bring the towers down. Well, now I'm going to shift gears to something called ideation. Ideation 1978. What ideation means is you have an idea, and you want to put the idea into the mind of the public, and that's called ideation, projecting the idea. This movie in 1978, made by the big Israeli agent Arnon Milchan, his first movie, features a 747 flying into a Pan Am building. Where did he get that idea from? The movie's called Medusa Touch. It starred Richard Burton. It was a French-English production. Here's the cover of the movie. And Arnon Milchan is not just a Hollywood producer from Israel. Arnon Milchan is Israel's top agent in the United States. He was involved in a super-secret organization called Lacham. Lacham was even so secret that the Mossad didn't know about it. What its job was to procure the material and devices necessary for Israel's nuclear arsenal. It was working directly under Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres is the father of Israel's nuclear program. Arnon Milchan was the person who made all that happen. He, for example, was involved in the illegal smuggling of 830 nuclear triggers to the state of Israel in 1985. When the American authorities discovered this, they prosecuted all of his underlings, the American guys. He was not even indicted in the lawsuit. And Israel said, well, we'll give you back 400 of them. So they kept 450 of the triggers, and they gave back 400. What a deal, huh? Here it is in 1978, the same year he made this movie. Here he is talking with his good friend Ezer Weizman, Israel's defense minister. I showed this picture to give you an idea of how high this guy goes. He is at the very top of the Israeli military intelligence apparatus. And he's making movies about planes flying into buildings. Here he is with two of his buddies. He's with Shimon Peres, the man that he's always worked for and admired. He calls him his best friend, and Bibi Netanyahu. What's interesting is that Milchan he's probably going to win an Academy Award. Is it tonight, Tonight. Yeah, that's right. He's probably going to get the third one. He gets one every year in a row. This time he's probably going to get an Academy Award for Revenant. And but what's interesting is that he's said to be worth $5.2 billion, one of the richest moguls in Hollywood, second one, they say. But the problem is that he has a long history of being a money launderer. This is written in his biography. He laundered money for Israel and South Africa. So the question is, where does his billions, where does that money come from? Is it drug money? Is it hush money? What is it? Well, it's certainly not his money. And in the year 2000, he made a film with his buddy Rupert Murdoch, the pilot episode of this program called The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of the X-Files. And the pilot episode featured a scene in which a Boeing passenger aircraft was remotely hijacked as it was flying along on autopilot. Now that's very important to understand. This is happening with increasing frequency now. That pilots are flying along like Malaysian Airlines 370. They're flying along to Peking, and suddenly the plane starts flying itself somewhere else. That's what happened to Flight 370. That's what happened to Egypt Air 990. That's what happened to the plane that was flying across the Sinai, the Russian airliner. These planes are being remotely hijacked. Sometimes they're simply changing the waypoints. Sometimes they're taking over control of the plane and doing things like this. When a plane like that does something like this a few times, the tail's going to break off. The forces on the tail are just going to snap it right off. You all live from Seattle, you understand how Boeings operate. Well, that's what they do. And he made this film with his partner, Murdoch, and I dare say that this idea of the plane flying into the building, the World Trade Center, came from Mr. Milchan. He has a history of making such movies, doesn't he? Another form of ideation is this intellectual ideation, I call it, in which the idea is put out there into the academic community, into the hallways of power in Washington. They all read the CFR magazine, Foreign Affairs. This came out in 1998, and Philip Zelikow was the head of the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group. And when they finished the study group, they wrote this report. And the report was Catastrophic Terrorism, Tackling the New Danger. Ashton Carter, John Deutsch, Philip Zelikow. Ashton Carter is, of course, today our Defense Secretary. Philip Zelikow was the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission. And it says here, they're imagining the transforming event, the event that's going to change America. And lo and behold, they say on the bottom, this is something that could happen next month. Well, they had to wait about 2 years, and it happened. But this document, this kind of material, is meant for the intelligentsia in this country to read and absorb and ponder and think, yes, well, if something does happen, what are we going to do? And this kind of like lays out the blueprint. This is what you should do. Here are some of the authors. The key author is Ashton Carter at the top. Philip Zelikow is not in this picture. The man in the middle is John Deutsch. This is when these men wrote this article and worked on this project. They were partners of Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. And the purpose of this company and the Rothschilds taking over this company is to make acquisitions of and investments in technology, defense, and aerospace-related companies. So basically to get on the gravy train of that $600 billion a year. Another group that was involved in the ideation of 9/11 was this group, the Project for a New American Century, also called PNAC, which is basically a family-owned enterprise. It's no longer existing, of the Donald Kagan and his two sons, or I would say Kagan. Donald Kagan here, the Lithuanian-born cross-eyed fellow on the far left, his two sons on the right, and Mrs. Victoria Nuland is Mrs. Robert Kagan. You might remember that Mrs. Victoria Nuland is the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of Eurasia. She's the person who basically fomented the crisis in Kiev all by herself. She appointed the man who became the Prime Minister of Ukraine, who is a staunch anti-Russian in a country where about a third of the population is Russian, a recipe for disaster. But they knew that by putting an anti-Russian person in power, they would create a civil war in Ukraine. That's what they got. And she has brought the United States and Russia closer to a war footing than anybody in the last 50 years. And they produced this document called the Rebuilding America's Defenses 1 year before 9/11, in which they said the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 was that new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 kickstarted the war on terror and put the Zionist war agenda in full gear. This is Philip Zelikow. This is the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report. He wrote it. And he has a degree from Rice University, his master's or his doctorate, in which his specialty, his thesis was how to create and maintain the public myth, which is what the 9/11 Commission is. The 9/11 Commission report is basically an encapsulation of the myth of 9/11, which is what we were supposed to take away from the attack. So now I'm going to shift over to a little bit of reality. You all are probably pretty savvy about the 9/11 story. Very quickly, I'm going to point out some of the most conspicuous anomalies. In this photograph, you see, first of all, The entry wound where the plane came in, you see a tremendous explosion coming out of that. Then, of course, on the right, you see the burning kerosene. But you see this white-hot burning object that's coming out from behind that pole. That white-hot burning object is not part of the plane. That appears to be the warhead of a depleted uranium missile, burning white-hot. These photographs indicate that when the plane hit the South Tower, there was a missile pod on the bottom of the plane which apparently fired a missile which entered the building just before the plane hit. Here you see the bottom of the plane, and again, the bottom of this plane, appears to be a 767 Boeing tanker, not a United Airlines Flight 175, because you can see there's this groove along the center of the bottom of the plane. That it appears to be a 767 tanker aircraft that's been converted for this purpose. This is probably a drone, probably being flown remotely. And it's got, on the bottom, you see that white and red object. That appears to be the pod and the missile that was fired. Here, this photograph is very important. This shows you that just before that plane hit the tower, there was a white-hot hole that missile had opened up in the building. And you can see that that hole is large enough to allow the entry of that fuselage of that plane directly into the tower. Nothing's going to stop it. Of course, you know, the towers were mostly glass and some steel, 2-to-1 ratio. But this object opened up this hole and created a white-hot atmosphere, a white-hot temperature inside the tower, which means that when the plane entered and the fuel got dispersed, that would combust immediately. And any explosives that were put on the floor, any pre-placed explosives, would also be detonated by this device, which is exactly what happened. You see that the kerosene, the jet fuel, is burning with vigor. Obviously, most of the jet fuel burned in the first couple seconds. And here we see these two critters coming out the front side of the explosion. It's part of the missile is flying out on the far left with a white smoke behind it. The white-hot object you see there, that's the culprit. That's burning white-hot, and it's burning so hot that the oxides don't become visible until after they've cooled off a little bit. So you see there's a gap between the white-hot object and then those dark oxides. And I worked a lot on depleted uranium at the Livermore. I met with a scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars. His name was Marion Falk. And I studied depleted uranium because it's a very big health threat for soldiers and people in the world today. And I asked him, does this object burning here that we see coming out with great velocity, does this have the characteristics of a burning DU warhead, depleted uranium warhead? And he said, yes, it does. Here again, you see it's coming out there on the far right. You see it's burning white hot. Well, that clearly is not part of the aircraft. That's no way is that part of the aircraft. Here we see the explosion coming out the entry point where the plane went into the South Tower. And on the far side, behind the Marriott sign on the hotel, you can see the burning kerosene on the other side. But this is clearly, there was a very vigorous explosion coming out of this hole. I call this the white smoke of thermite because when thermite detonates, when thermite burns, a thermitic reaction, it creates white smoke, and then it reduces whatever the oxidizer is to its basic element, whether it's iron or molybdenum or what have you, and you get molten iron or molten molybdenum, and you get incredible heat. And that's what we see here is we see this white smoke. The first thing that came out of these explosions was white smoke, indicative of thermite. Again, the white smoke, you see the bright white smoke, and then the black smoke from the burning fuel. More of the same. South Tower, the big conflagration. North Tower, a similar type thing. This is when it hit the Marshall McLennan's computer room. The South Tower, it also went into a computer room. It went into a secure computer room belonging to Fuji Bank. So the computer room probably played a key role in the explosion and in the homing of the plane. But here we see the plane hit the North Tower, and the computer room that belonged to Marshall McLennan was on the north side and the east side of this tower. And on the east side, you see a tremendous explosion coming out perpendicular to the path of the plane. This like cotton bale, this big cotton bale coming out the side. That indicates that there was some very energetic explosion that shot out the east side of the tower. The Pentagon, this is before the collapse. This is shortly, like in the first half hour after the plane struck. What you see here is that you don't see any damage to the grass. We're told that this big plane came in at grass level, basically over the top of the grass. But it didn't seem to hit these big spools, these cable spools that were out there in the lawn. They're still standing. And there's no evidence of a plane having struck the building.